what if there was another Earth? And what if on that other Earth, there was another you? Maybe that other version of you made different choices or different mistakes. Now imagine, what if instead there were infinite Earths and infinite versions of you? This is, of course, the theory behind the multiverse. What if there were infinite other versions of this universe or this reality? And in each of those other universes, on each of those other Earths, things are different. Maybe a little different, maybe a lot different. Marvel movies have popularized multiverse theory in recent years, but this isn't exclusively a Marvel idea. It's actually a very common science fiction trope. DC Comics long ago featured a crisis on infinite Earths. Rick and Morty is a popular animated series in which protagonists regularly encounter versions of themselves from other dimensions. You've got Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. You've got Community's Darkest Timeline episode. How about Fringe? Anybody remember Fringe? But where did this idea of the multiverse, of parallel universes, come from? Let me posit something. Way back in the 1660s, a woman named Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, a British aristocrat, was among the first people to conceive of, to imagine, a multiverse. It's kind of an amazing thing because Cavendish has been largely forgotten. She's kind of a minor figure in the history of science and in the history of literature. But in the 1660s, she wrote this work called A Description of the Blazing World, in which she imagines and represents for us parallel Earths. It might be one of the first works of science fiction ever written, and it might also be the first appearance of the multiverse. Over the course of this video, I'm going to tell you the story of Cavendish's multiverse novel. I'm going to divide this summary into 3 parts. This is part 1, which I'm going to call Pirates and Talking Animals. So the Blazing World begins with this beautiful young lady who lives in a seaside town, and she's kidnapped by pirates. Then the gods, angered by this injustice, whip up a storm, and they take this pirate ship and sweep it to the North Pole. It's of course very cold, and all the pirates freeze to death. But then, Cavendish tells us, wait for it, the young lady is kept warm by the radiance of her beauty. This is when things get weird. Cavendish advances this theory that you cannot circumnavigate the globe from north to south, and instead that if you travel to the North Pole, you will find a kind of portal to an alternate Earth. This is how the young lady finds herself on the Blazing World. And once she's there, she immediately encounters animals who walk and talk. She meets bear people, geese people, fox people, even insect people. These animal beings are very civil, and they take the young lady to meet the Emperor. She's so beautiful, he immediately falls in love with her and makes her the Empress of the entire planet. Why are we drawn to this idea of parallel universes? What's the appeal of the multiverse? So the multiverse, I think, might be this particular kind of a myth. This story we use to talk about and think about paths not taken, alternative lives, alternative histories. What if things had gone differently? It's a story we tell that allows us to focus in on these critical junctures, these moments in our lives or in world history, these moments when there was a real crossroads, like a real potential for things to be radically different. And it's interesting to think that Cavendish lived through a civil war. This was one of those moments when English history really took a turn. So let me tell you a little bit about Margaret Cavendish. She was born in England in the 1620s. Much like her contemporaries, John Milton, Thomas Hobbes, much of her adult life was defined by the English Civil War. During this war, the English monarchy was overthrown, and England actually became a republic for a number of decades. Cavendish met her husband in Paris because he had left England. He was on the royalist side, and so the losing side of the Civil War. And she was a fairly prolific writer throughout her life, and she wasn't just a novelist, or she wrote poetry, she wrote plays, she also wrote works of science and philosophy. In fact, this novel we're going to talk about, The Blazing World, the one about the multiverse, it was included in a book which also contained some of her scientific writing. It was called Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. And in that work, Cavendish signals to us her interest in the expansiveness of the universe, of life on other planets, and maybe other worlds just like our own. So she writes, "Scripture expresses the framing of this world, yet it doth not say that nature herself was then created, but only that this world was put into such a frame and state as it is now. And who knows, but there may have been many other worlds before, and of another figure than this is. Nay, if nature be infinite, there must also be infinite worlds. So here we have Cavendish in 1666 theorizing about the infinite expanse of the universe and the possibility of infinite worlds. And I honestly don't know how unprecedented this is. My general sense is that she's participating in a broader scientific discourse in the period. So one of the things I want to figure out is how original is Margaret Cavendish? And for that, I got to do some research. So I started doing some reading on Margaret Cavendish, her possible influences, the scientific discourse in the 17th century. Who else was talking and thinking about an infinite universe and infinite worlds? But then, for a while, I fell down a rabbit hole trying to understand the science behind the multiverse. Okay, so the opening claim in this article kind of like bubbles, infinitely branching off of each other. Triangles exist and don't exist. So what follows from this is that the idea is that the universe is really, really big. Everything that is has some share of reality. If you had an infinite number of monkeys working on an infinite number of typewriters, hard for me to wrap my head around.
I've decided that the multiverse makes no sense. Just on the face of it. Like, and if it's just bigness, if the idea is just like, well, it's so big that there must be another Earth out there. But even if there were another planet of humans, there's no way they are also, like, there's one that happens to look like me. Like, the odds of that happening would just be impossible.
So I've been doing some reading about the history of the universe. And this one familiar name came up. I was reminded about this guy named Giordano Bruno. And so, friends, we need to talk about Bruno. Bruno was this Dominican friar. He wrote prolifically and traveled throughout Europe talking about science and cosmology. And he was executed by the church. And one of his heretical opinions was about the infinite character of the universe. One of his works was called On the Infinite Universe and Worlds. And in that book, he made the following claim. Thus is the excellence of God magnified, and the greatness of his kingdom made manifest. He is glorified not in one, but in countless suns, not in a single earth, but in 1,000, I say, in an infinity of worlds. One of the earliest arguments for the infinite nature of the universe had to do with God. And the argument actually makes a lot of sense. If God exists, and if God is infinite, therefore, existence must be infinite. The interesting thing is that it's not an empirical argument, right? It's actually a logical or philosophical argument. So some of the earliest arguments for the infinity of the universe had this theological component to them. Now, even Bruno is probably not the first person to come up with this idea, but he does help popularize it throughout Europe. But you can see through Bruno how these ideas were circulating among the scientific community about a generation before Cavendish started writing. But you can also see how she innovates, because these are theories about the bigness of the universe, right? It's infinite expanse. They don't really seem to include a conception of multiple duplicate versions of Earth or multiple versions of ourselves, which have now become a standard feature of multiverse stories. This is an area where Cavendish does seem to innovate, because her story does have multiple selves. Now back to the Blazing World and part 2. Multiple Margarets. So immediately after she has been crowned Empress of the entire planet, Our Lady of the Blazing World sets up research institutes for the advancement of science. She puts different species of animal folk to work in different disciplines. So the bird people become the astronomers and the spider people become the mathematicians. I guess because they have lots of legs and they're good at counting or something. Then the middle of the book includes these long dialogues with various groups of animal people about scientific scientific theories. The Empress is able to show off her scientific expertise as she disputes with various animal people about the utility of telescopes or the philosopher's stone. And she discovers the Blazing World has some pretty advanced science or technology. They've got this rock called firestone that ignites when it gets wet. They've got this oil that allows for eternal youth. And in this phase of the novel, it's quite clear that the Empress is really a stand-in for Cavendish herself. But then there's a twist. The Empress tells her subjects she'd like to write a book, but she needs help, a scribe. And her subjects said they could bring to her any writer, living or dead, that she could imagine. They have that power, so she could have Aristotle, Plato, Galileo. She says no to all that, and then they suggest, well, there is this one woman. Her name is Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle. Wait, what? A twist! We are then told that the Duchess of Newcastle lives on a third world called Earth. Not the Blazing World or the world where the lady was kidnapped by pirates, which I just assumed was Earth when I first read this book. But that first world was not our world, that's some other world. So the Empress, who is like our author, an early modern science expert, summons the Duchess of Newcastle, who is our author from an alternate reality, to be her secretary and best friend. And truly, their meeting did produce such an intimate friendship between them that they became platonic lovers, although they were both females.
I'm just reading this and I'm trying to think of precedents for Cavendish's work. Particularly these anthropomorphized animals. It's a little bit like a fairy tale. Maybe it's a bit like Aesop's fables. I'm trying to think of other pre-modern or early modern texts where animals walk and talk.
This thing about the animals matters because I'm trying to situate Cavendish within a literary tradition and a history of science tradition. But by doing that, I think I'm also trying to figure out where the multiverse fits in. Like, where does this idea come from and what does it mean to us? Because there's a way in which the Blazing World is a lot like more conventional travel and adventure narratives from the early modern period. There are lots of stories about travels to distant lands, all the way back to the Odyssey and the Aeneid, right? Think of Bacon's New Atlantis, or a century later, we start to see things like Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, stories of visiting strange lands populated by strange beings. That's a very old story. And so there's a way that the Blazing World is kind of like that, but the travel to another world is a little bit different. And remember, this is like hundreds of years before stories like the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter. And so partly, I think we can understand multiverse stories as versions of those more traditional travel narratives. They're both stories about another world, another place where rules, laws, history, customs are different.
So, like, one of the things we think of that we want multiverse stories to do is to offer us a glimpse of roads not traveled or paths not taken. Like, what if this thing had turned out differently? And in the context of the Blazing World, it has this particular social and political dimension, because the question is, what if there were a world where women had power? For women in the period, power was in short supply. So there's a really interesting gender component here, because I think part of Cavendish's attraction to the multiverse is that here is this environment where she can play out what it means to have power. And she's actually explicit about this in the text.
At the beginning of her work, Cavendish writes, "I have neither the power, time, nor occasion to conquer the world as Alexander and Caesar did, yet rather than not be a mistress of one, I have made a world of my own."
Now, like, one of the things that's actually kind of disturbing about this book is how the Empress uses her power.
Now, last but not least, Part 3, Sovereign Fire. So here is how the story ends. Buckle up. Our Empress hears that her home country in her homeworld is under attack. So she consults with her other self from an alternate reality, the Duchess of Newcastle, and they decide to build submarines and mount an interplanetary invasion. This is written in 1666. So the Empress orders fish people, there are fish people too, to build submarines to take them to her homeworld. And then they weaponize the Firestone. Remember that rock that ignites when it gets wet? Yeah, just wait. So the homeworld that Cavendish goes to protect is a thinly veiled stand-in for England. She shows up to defend it from an alternate reality Europe, which makes what happens next especially disturbing. She shows up in an illuminated gown, has her fish people carry her across the waves so it seems like she's walking on water like a god. Then she orders her fishmen to take the Firestone under the enemy ships and unleash it so that the water itself is set on fire and the enemies are consumed by flames. She's like Daenerys. It's actually a Daenerys moment, like burn it all. She destroys the entire navy in fire. But then, neither would she return into the Blazing World until she had forced all the rest of that world to submit. She has her agents place Firestone in all the enemy cities so that when it rains, they are consumed by fire, until all the enemies of this alternate England submit to its authority. So the whole novel is a fantasy of power. And partly it's about women's agency, but also it's about a militarized imperial power. I think as a myth, the multiverse allows us to focus in on these critical moments in human life and maybe world history. And the kind of ironic thing I think about multiverse narratives is that on the one hand, they seem to suggest that like the lives of individuals are insignificant, right? That they don't mean anything because, there's actually infinite versions of you. So what does one of you matter? But actually, they illustrate the opposite, because what they often suggest is that one decision, even a small decision, can have enormous consequences. So the actions of one person, one individual, can have a chain reaction that changes the whole course of human history. And in that way, a multiverse story actually affirms the importance of your life and your actions. So it's hard to say whether Cavendish is the originator of this idea. Certainly other writers and scientists, philosophers were thinking about the expansiveness of the universe and imagining other worlds. But Cavendish's representation of multiple Earths and multiple versions of herself definitely seems to be among the first representations of a multiverse as we've come to think about it. Let me know if there are other examples, and maybe in other traditions there are older versions, more ancient versions of these multiverse myths. But it does seem that Cavendish is among the first to write a story about the multiverse. My name is Dr. Moore. I teach great books at St. Thomas University. If you enjoyed this video, you should check out another one over here, which is also about a great literary work and the philosophical questions that arise from it. Thanks for watching. Talk soon.